Translations. There are a lot. And many people think there are three major types: word for word, thought for thought, and paraphrase. Oh, and the fourth, heresy. But actually, there are five, according to scholars and textual critics. There are five main translation theories. What are they? Well, first, interlinear. This is taking like for instance, the Greek, and then put it in Greek word order, and then beneath that is a gloss of meaning to help you understand what that word is within the grammatical structure of the word. And the same is true for the Hebrew and the Aramaic. Then there's the formal equivalence. This is trying to reflect a grammatical structure of the original text, and it's making the translation more apparent or transparent to the original, quote unquote. They try to adhere as close as possible to the Greek and Hebrew words and be as minimally interpretive as they possibly can. But we have to understand that there is not a single translation we have that is not interpretive in some way. In fact, all translations are interpretive, and they have to follow certain rules that they set upon themselves on how they're going to handle interpretation and translation so that they can make a consistent one for the reader to have. That way it provides a little more clarity in why they chose certain things. And if you read the beginning of your Bible, they actually give you what their goal was and their theory, what they chose to work with and how they handled it. But the disadvantage of the formal is that it can be kind of clunky in some places, not as clunky as the interlinear, but still clunky in many ways, and it can provide some awkward moments based on the fact that English style is very different than the Greek and especially the Hebrew and Aramaic, and it doesn't always make it easy to understand what is being conveyed in the passage. Now, does that mean you can't trust it? Absolutely not. It just means you have a lot more homework to do to try to really understand what's being said there. Then you have the functional/dynamic equivalents. This would be like your NIV and CSB. The goal is to convey the meaning of the original text in the target language, but it still focuses on using words and grammatical structures. It takes a little more interpretation to make it understandable. For instance, William Mounce worked on the ESV and the NIV, and he was that the ESV wants to stick to the grammar and the words, but the NIV wants to communicate the meaning of the Greek. And so the upside is that you get the meaning, you still get some of the same wording and grammatical structure, and you get more understand the nuance. The downside is that it's maybe not as transparent, or maybe not as literal, which even then translators will tell you that there's technically no such thing as a literal translation. If you want a literal Hebrew Bible, you read the Hebrew. If you want a literal Greek Bible, you read the Greek, because that is the original language in its original context, in its original culture, in its original time. And understanding that is how you get the most literal understanding. And even then, literal doesn't always mean what we think it means. But we'll get there in a second. Then there is natural language. Natural language tries to repeat the meaning of the Greek in the most natural English style possible. The upside is that it's much easier to read and understand, and it still conveys all the essentials we need to know. The downside is it can introduce, according to Mounce, some ideas are not necessarily in the Greek grammar, but it does this in the effort to achieve natural English, meaning that because Greek, for instance, and its grammar is extremely different than English, for instance, there's no punctuation, it tries to bring some ways of understanding in the natural English, knowing that they're going to have to make some sacrifices. And it's not that they're trying to corrupt it, they're just trying to understand that our grammar is very different than theirs, and they're trying to figure out how we can convey it the most natural way possible for a reader who maybe is newer or not as equipped in reading, or maybe is younger, and many other ways. And then there's the transculturation/paraphrase, and this is seeking to be more understandable and relevant in modern culture rather than focus on historical precision. No one I know in the scholar world communicates this as an actual Bible, but they would still say it can be useful for helping someone to understand the gospel. And so therefore, it's technically a translation because it's trying to follow the text, but it's not necessarily like a Bible itself. So really, there are five main theories, and the ones I would probably recommend the most to people would be, depending on your situation, either the formal, the functional, or the natural. I probably would lean more formal and functional, but I still see a great value in the natural as well as the interlinear at times. So those are actually the five main types. And which translations would those involve? Well, interlinear and interlinear. A formal would be like an ESV, NET, and KJV, NASB 1994 and 2020. A functional / dynamic would be like your NIV and your CSB, and a natural would be like your NLT, and a transculturation would be more like the Message. And then there's heresy, which is like the Queen James, Passion, etc., etc. And there are many other ones besides that. But if you read the beginning of each of your Bibles, you actually will see where they explain what their goal was, what the rules were, and the theory they're following, as well as what manuscripts they use and how they're handling certain texts. What does italics mean? What does the underline mean? What does the bold mean? Etc., etc. So they actually provide for you their goals in the front. And the purpose of this is to understand that we have so many translations because Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic don't necessarily cleanly translate into English. Does that mean we can't trust our English Bibles? No, of course we can trust it. But actually, it just shows the beauty of the fact we have so many because we live in a different culture and a different time with different language, that we have so many translations that if you bring them together, we actually come to a deeper understanding of what's going on here in the text. I frequently will study with the ESV and the NIV like together, and I read the NLT and the CSB like casually to help me understand some more of the nuance. And I study from the New King James, I study from the NASB, and I teach from like a bunch of different kinds of translations. Here you see me usually use the ESV, but in other places I use different translations, depending on the context. So there's a great value in having so many. So before we mention, what does it mean by there is no such thing technically as a literal translation apart from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek? I actually want to read for you William Mounce's thing. If you ask most people what kind of Bible they want, many will say they want a literal Bible. What complicates matters is their assumption that literal means as close to word for word as possible, and they equate word for word with accurate. But this mistaken belief about literal is inaccurate on many levels. The fact of the matter is that there is only one literal Bible. The literal Old Testament is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the literal New Testament is written in Greek. However, if you want to read the Bible in English, there is no such thing as a literal translation, nor is one even possible. The first meaning of the word literal is listed in Oxford Dictionary of English, is taking words in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or allegory. In other words, literal primarily refers to the meaning of a word or passage, not its form. So a literal translation is one that conveys the meaning of the original faithfully, but it doesn't mean the translation must convey the meaning of the original in the same form. Just because a Greek sentence uses 8 words doesn't mean that the English translation must also use 8. Just because the Greek uses a participle doesn't mean English must do likewise. What we want is a translation that accurately conveys the meaning of the Greek words, not their form. The latest edition of the Oxford Dictionary of English has a new second definition for the word literal, representing the exact words of the original text. Again, however, we should ask if this is even possible and whether any translation actually does this. In the following discussion, I'm using literal in the second sense. And he continues on. And he goes on to describe why the Bible is still trustworthy, and we can trust our English Bibles today. But understand this, the doctrine of inerrancy does not apply to your modern Bible today. It applies to the original one. Because we understand that there's going to be some things we have that are, maybe not necessarily the most correct. And, we understand that some of the copies have grammatical and spelling mistakes. But we understand is that when we actually compare all the copies, we understand what the original was. And that's the one that was guided, that God guided the authors to write. Now, I believe he guided us to translate into numerous translations. And I'm not saying we can't, trust our translations, but when we say inerrancy, that really falls onto the original texts. So, why are there so many translations? Well, we're trying to take an ancient text and bring it into the modern day, an ancient culture, bring it into the modern day, an ancient time, and bring it into understand the modern day. And we have to understand that English is a very different culture, time, and words altogether. So there's so many because they're trying to follow certain rules to make a consistent translation to help the readers understand more and more of the things we can find in the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And I think it's really beautiful we have so many because we can compare and see all these different things and have a deeper and more rich understanding of the text without even having to learn Hebrew and Greek. Now, I do recommend learning those things, but we don't have to necessarily if you want to get the most essential understanding of the text. And then, what is the best one? The best one is going to be the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Technically speaking, it's the best translation. But if you want my recommendations, if you want an interlinear, just get an interlinear. If you want a formal, again, ESV, NKJV, NASB 1994 or 2020 be my recommendations personally. But I've heard some other ones that are really good too. Functional, I typically recommend the NIV or the CSB. natural language, probably the NLT. And then transculturations, while I've never read one of these, I do know that there's many out there. I would not recommend this as being your personal only Bible. I recommend getting one of the other ones as well, but you can look into those as well, especially if you're young in the faith. So I hope this helps answer the question about translations, and I would recommend going to Why Trust the Bible by William Mounce, as he explains in further detail one, why you can trust it based on textual criticism, translation theory, history, and so much more.